Hello, this is Praveen. Welcome to .NET.Gurukul.com for the ASP.NET Core Web API training from beginners to advanced. Okay, today we are in Module 1, Foundations of REST and Web API. Session 3, Introduction to ASP.NET Core Web API project structure. Okay, so here are the agenda items for this particular session 3. Like in this particular session 3, first I'm going to discuss on the Web API folder structure. Okay, project structure. Okay, I'm going to explain each of this file in detail. Okay, and like in the next we'll discuss on what is ASP.core pipelines, okay, and role of middleware, okay. And I'm going to deep dive with the controller class. Like in this controller class, like it is not like with your MVC controller. This is Web API controller, okay. And Web API controller is decorated with respect with this attribute API controller attribute, okay. So I'm going to discuss on this API controller in detail, like why it is important, okay. So what's the importance of this API controller and automatic validations, automatic model validations, and binding, everything like in this API controller we'll do a demo, okay. So let's get started. So understanding the folder structure, like when you create a web API project, like in the Visual Studio, so it will have these folders like in these files. Okay, so first like in this program.cs class file, controllers folder, okay, app.json, properties, launching settings, everything. Like so here, each of this file has some specifications, like in certain standards, like in certain purpose. Okay, so in the program.cs class file is for application startup, okay, dependency injection setup, okay, middleware pipelines. Okay, so I'm going to explain that in detail. Okay, so for now you understand, like in the program.cs class file, like in the startup class file, like in your dependency files, like in your interfaces, like in your dependency injection, like all the interfaces I'm going to register over in the program.cs class file. Your middleware class, your middlewares, everything like that, it could be JW token or in your OAuth, everything like in this particular registrations will go in the program.cs class file. Okay, in the controller class, it contains the web API controllers, like where it might have like with communication with the database, like having this business validations, like having these repositories to connect to the database. Okay, so the controller is the starting point, like in the which holds the endpoints. Okay, so it takes care of your request and the response. Okay, and the app.json is like the environment based configuration, your database configurations and database connection strings and all the stuff will be there. Okay, in the launchings, like in this launchings, I have this which number, port number, and whichever this hosted environment, I'm going to have this. Okay, let me open the Visual Studio and show you that folder structure. Just wanted to close all this stuff. Okay, so here we are in module 1 session 3. Okay, so if you can see these folders, like in this particular thing, you have something called as properties. Okay, properties, and you have this controllers folder. Okay, models folder I have added manually. Okay, so for now you understand, like in this particular thing, you have something called as properties. Like in the properties, you will have something called as launch settings.json. Okay, so it will decide the what is the HTTP and what is the HTTPS request. Okay, and how where is being posted. See here, your HTTP application hosting URL, application URL. Here is your HTTPS. Okay, it is running under 7000. This is running under 5057, right? So you have these settings like in your profile levels, like whether it is could be HTTP, whether it could be HTTPS. Okay, all the hosting related things, launch settings, like in your launching the application, like this launch setting.json is the main entry point. Okay, so having that configuration. So the next thing is like in this program.cs class file. So program.cs class file is the most important thing that you need to understand. Okay, so your startup, like any of this request, okay, it directly doesn't go to jump to a controller and execute the endpoints. Okay, so here is your complete configuration, like any of this request, it will first come to the program.cs class file. Okay, here you will have the complete configuration with your application. Okay, it creates the builder and it will add the controllers. Okay, it will build an application, and it is checking whether it is like it is like the development or something. Okay, and it uses the HTTPS redirection and using the authorization, mapping the controllers. Okay, with if you are using JWT token, you have to configure here. Okay, if you are using the OAuth, you have to configure here. So nothing but your complete middleware, how the controller has to behave, everything will be taken care of with your program.cs class file. Okay. So your dependency injections, like whichever the interfaces or the classes that you define, and you are going to communicate with your database, right? So everything has to be configured over here. Okay, that interfaces configuration can be a singleton or transient or in scope. Okay, so here is the programming, like the starting point, like whenever a request comes, it directly doesn't go to jump to the controller. Okay, the first request will be there in the first breakpoint will hit over to this program.cs class. Okay, I just put a breakpoint over here. Okay, I hope you understand with the properties folder, like in this launch settings and in the program.cs class file. Okay. So now that like it has a controller. Okay. So this is the endpoint where the your where it holds the endpoints. Okay. Your CRUD operations or with your business validations, where with your repositories, and everything will be communicated, will be happened. The complete logic for this controller will be happen here in the controller. And please remember, this is not the MVC controller. This is Web API controller. Okay, so which has this annotation with API controller. Okay, so that's what it makes your web API controller, not your MVC controller. MVC controller has a support with working with the views, right? So here it has the returning the responses and the status codes. Okay, so that's the main difference. Okay, so understand, this is not with your MVC controller, which has a support with working with the views, which is this is the controller with the API controller. Okay, and you can add the models. Okay, models folder with your entity frameworks, with your database entity objects. Okay, and you can also have the service folders, and you can have the repositories folders. Okay, where we have the business logic in the services, and we have the repositories with your database. Okay, and with the data you will have the db context object. Okay, so we'll understand that particular folder structure in much in detail. Okay, for now, I hope you understand with all this stuff. Okay, so you understand, you have this properties folder, like in launching the launching settings, controller, like in the program.cs class file, which is the entry point. Okay, all the configuration, whichever you are using with whichever the interfaces, or whichever the, like in whichever the packages that you are using, like whether it could be a JWT or whether it's got or anything, like you have to configure with respect to your program.cs class file. Then it goes to the controller. Okay, so controller is the web API controller. It's not your MVC controller. Okay, so now let me connect to my tab and explain you that in detail. Okay, okay, yeah, it's got connected. Okay, let's understand ASP.NET Core Web API folder structure and pipelines. So any of this particular request, okay, it doesn't directly jump into your controller. Okay, it will have first request with your program.cs class file. Okay, the first request will come with the program.cs class file. Okay, from program.cs class file, it will jump with your controller. Okay, and in the controller, you'll have something like in the action methods, right? And the action methods will have the action verbs. Action verbs are nothing but your post, get, okay, batch and delete. Okay, and you'll get the final response. So this is the basic pipeline that you come across in most of the applications, right? Like in this thing. So program.cs class file, like in understanding the program, first of all, you need to understand the program.cs class file. So what the program.cs class file contains, like all the startup, whether it is like with your startup project. Okay, it is like the startup, like in your dependency injection interfaces. Okay, dependency injection. Okay, middleware. See, consider I have this particular interface, I product controller, and have the direct class products controller. Okay, so where it will have these methods to read the data from the products data from the database. Okay, so I have to register everything with the dependency injection, whether it could be singleton, whether it could be transient or in scope. I have to register that with the dependency injection over here. Okay, I have to, whether you are using the JWT or OAuth, I have to register in the middleware. Okay, I consider that as a middleware. Okay, so example, middleware example like JWT or OAuth. Okay, so here is a simple like thing. So what is here I consider this as a middleware. Why I consider this as the middleware? So before hitting to the controller, I wanted to make sure it has the valid user by with authenticated with a JWT token or with OAuth token. Okay, so I before hitting the controller, I am making sure it has a valid user by using proper authentication process. So that's what I call this as a middleware. So in program.cs class file will completely help you to register all your dependencies, register all your middlewares, and that will act as the startup. Okay, and that thing like whether it is a HTTP redirection, HTTPS redirection, or the routing configurations. Okay, the mapping to the controllers, and it will run that application, right? So this is the basic like understanding the program.cs class file. In the controller, you have something called as API controller attribute. Okay, and the controller is decorated with your API controller. This is not with your MVC controller. Okay, this is your web API controller. How it is possible with this API controller attribute? Okay, this controller holds the your endpoint. Okay, this will holds the endpoint where it will take your request and the response. Okay, okay, receive, request, and process, response. So this is the basic building block of your application. Like in your controller, it will hold the request, and it has this taking the capability to take the request, HTTP request, and process your response. Okay, so and in your action methods, like in the action methods, you will have something called as like the HTTP get, post, okay, patch, and delete. Okay, so on the finally you'll get a JSON response. Okay, so I hope you understand with your pipelines like in the thing. So it is not like necessary, like it should definitely follow this thing. I can make sure like I can have this navigations to be defined with my own implementation. For example, let's say in the program.cs class file, I wanted to add a in the middleware process in the program.cs class file, I wanted to add a middleware folder. Okay, I can have this particular middleware folder over here. Okay, I can have the middleware folder here. For the controller for the controller, I have something called as with on the controller side. I wanted to add something like with the business logic. I wanted to have the business logic. For the business logic, I will add the services folder. Okay, for the business logic. So for working with your databases, I wanted to add with your repositories. I may have a repository folders with database layer. Okay, so into your database, I have the data folder with your DB context. So I can have my own separation of concern, right? Like if you're having separate folder for the middleware, having separate folder for the service folder with respect to your business logic, with your repositories, I to work with the database, I have the repositories folder, and the data to have the entity framework related stuff. Okay, so the basic how it works is like the program.cs class file to your middleware, to your controller to the services, and services to the repository to the DB context, and the response. So remember this flow like in this thing. So we are not just working with the default template that with respect provided by the data with your VS Studio template, right? Web API template, right? So we are working with your in the future coming classes, like we will have this middleware folder with respect to service folders, repositories to work with the database, DB context, and with the response finally. Okay. So we can add like with the services repositories. Okay, this is very important. Like in we are not just working with the default template that Visual Studio is given us, right? Like with your web API template, we are not going to do the same separation of concern. We'll have our own separation of concern, where we'll have our own middleware folder, we'll have our own service folder and repositories folders, data folders for DP context, models, and all the stuff. Okay, so in this particular understanding the controllers, like I will do a demo like in without API controller. Okay, without API controller and with API controller. So API controller, like in with this API controller, it will have this complete automatic validation. Okay, so API controller will have this auto model validation. Okay, auto status code and auto response. So we will understand this in our demo. Like we'll understand, take a demo with the API controller. We how this API controller can auto validate your model. Okay, auto validate your response code and response status code and response. Okay, let me connect to maybe the studio. Yeah, here if you can see here, I have this model folder here. So if I have the open this model folder, I have this particular employee class. Like in this particular popo class, I have this particular required field validator for this full name. Okay, so this is the email. So if I wanted to give this field, like I have to mention at the rate for sure. Okay, and this aim, like in the age, like in it should be within the range of 18 to 60. Okay, and this particular department should be required. So these validations, okay, these are validations will be automatically done. Okay, okay. So we doesn't need to validate with your model. Okay, I manually do that. Okay, it will be automatically done. Okay, so within this controllers, I have this employees controller where we do. I'm not mentioning this particular API controller attribute. Okay, here if I can see, I have this particular API controller attribute. Okay, so now that I have this particular action method, like in this particular endpoint, which takes this employee JSON object, like in this particular object, like in the, I'm just giving a response, okay, response. Okay, so how this particular each and everything I have to mention manually. I have to write code to validate that model. Okay, so if I run this and show you. So I did for now. I didn't write any validations with the model. Okay, so as per the model, it has to validate this required field validators or email validator or range validator, right? So that is not going to work with respect without using an API controller attribute. Okay, so I have to do that manually. So while when you use that APM controller, it does automatically. Okay, so once you go to the demo, you'll understand. So for now, like you see that the first the breakpoint comes and hits to your program CS class. Okay, so later it will jump to with your controller. Okay, so let me run this. So I just wanted to open the Postman. I have this web API collection here. So with API, so this is without API. So here, if you can see, here is the post method, right? Like here is the post method. I have this API slash controller. So I have API slash controller name is employee with API. Okay, let me take another one. Okay, I just need to change this controller API slash employees. Okay, so here is my endpoint. Like when I click on this, like I have this particular full name. Okay, mark. I'm giving certain validation, like in the email and this age. Let me give the age as 17. Okay, even though I have given 17, it will process the request. Okay, so that validation fails. Okay, because I'm not using the API controller. See, I'm not using the API controller over here, so it just validates and it just it gives that message. It's saying that employee created. Okay, all the null values are 0. All the dummy with data is getting inserted into your database. Okay, and it is saying that okay response, okay, 200 response. So here it is not validated with your model, like it is not validated with respect to your model, and it is giving the relevant response, and it is giving and saying that 200. Okay, so that's what's the problem with respect to your without using an API controller. So if I use here, here I have to mention manually here. So if you say, let me do this manually. If not, model state dot is valid. So request to return the bad request. Here, see, I am writing manually, like in this manually, I need to manually model state validation, and I have to manually return the status code. Manually return status code. Here, the manual return status code is bad request, which is nothing but your 400. Okay. So this everything has to be done manually. Like in having this response, it has to be manually. So status code, it has to be manually, and the validation should be manually. So when I run this and test it out, so when I give an invalid request object to this API, let me remove this breakpoint at the program.cs class back. Okay. Yeah. When I run this, it will come here and it will check with this model validation. Okay. If you wanted to debug, you can check it out. Okay. It goes to the bad request. Okay. See this 400 bad request and this response. Okay. And this model validation, everything is manually. So everything you have to mention this is the bad request and this is the response and this is the model validation. Everything it should be manually. So I will use another controller which is nothing but the API controller. Okay. So now the model validation is by default. Okay, it is you don't need to write any of this particular model validation, and the response codes and the status codes, everything, the response, the model validations, the status code, everything is like automatically. So let me restart this one. Okay, I have this request object for this controller models employees with API. Okay, so here is my employees with API. So here is my employers with API. Okay, so what I'm doing is here I did not mention anything on the model validation, or I did not mention anything on the status codes. I did not mention anything on the response. Okay, so I'm simply giving this thing like in age, like in maintain. Okay, so I go to and hit this. Okay, so you see it is giving the bad request 400. Okay, so this particular model validation is done automatically using this particular API controller. If you don't use at this, don't decorate the class with the API controller attribute, so you have to do all the stuff manually. Okay, so this model validation is done automatically. The rest status code is done automatically. The response is also done automatically. See here I will give an invalid mark, something like I'm giving the invalid email ID. Okay, email ID should have at the rate for sure, right? So if I run this, that particular response will also done automatically. It says that email is like invalid. So whichever the thing, if you here, if you don't give this thing required field validator, it will give this response automatically, and it will take the relevant status code, okay, accordingly. So this is the simple like understanding your importance of the controllers. Okay, I hope you understand with the demo. Okay, so let me recap for you everything. So in this thing, like in the folder structures, like in this particular thing, so you will have the complete folders like in this properties, controllers, models. Okay, so models I have added manually. So understand the program.cs class file. Okay, and another thing is, sorry, I forgot with the app settings. App settings like with your database configuration. Okay, whichever the app settings that you wanted to have, like whether it could be a environment level settings or with your applications level setting, with your database connection strings, everything should be in the app settings. Okay, and the program.cs class file, you are already aware, like in your complete registration process will happen at the program.cs class file. Controllers, like we have seen the controllers, API controllers in the demo, and the launching in the properties folder. Okay, So understand like in the program.cs class file to your controller and to the action methods and response. Okay. So in this thing, like in the coming classes we will have this kind of a folder structures. Okay. So in the middlewares, you don't want it to write all the code in the program.cs class file and make it complicated, right? For all the middlewares, I'll take a separate folders and I will have their folder where I'll have a separate classes for this particular middlewares, and I will implement that, and I will register that class in the program.cs class file. Simple. Okay. So in the controller will have the endpoint. Okay. So that particular, it may have this business logic, it may have the database logic. Okay. And everything is there in the controller, right? So here also I wanted to segregate. I wanted to have a separation of concern. Like I wanted to have a service folder where it will have the business related information. Okay. For example, this particular business related information, let's say for this particular finance department, I wanted to make sure, let this employee should not have the salary more than something, some like margin. Okay, let's say the salary should not be more than 2 lakhs. Okay, something like that. I wanted to have a business logic for this particular department. So for that, I wanted to implement that in the business logic service folder. In the repositories layer, I wanted to, once this thing everything is go well goes, and it will go, I wanted to hit, and I wanted to store that into the database. I will store that all the related informations with respect to your repositories folder, and the database context, and the final response. So everything, whatever you are using, whether you are using the services or repositories layer, data, db context, everything, you have to register with respect to your program.cs class file. Okay. And you'll have this particular action methods, like whether with http get, post, patch, delete, and you'll get the final JSON. Okay. So let me complete this demo. Like I will say this is at the rate example. Okay. And this is like 27. Okay. When I done all the validations and go to this thing, like it will give the response. Okay. So here is my final JSON response. See here, I got the okay response 200. Okay. And here is the response that I got. Okay. So which is like with your raw, like we just returning this particular employee successful created. Okay. So in your response, you can return anything. So in this particular, consider with this particular I action result, like coming session, we'll try to know more about the I action result. Okay. So I hope you understand your complete session. Like that's it. That's it for this particular session. Okay, next session, like in the ASP.NET Core training, like in the next session, like controller in web API. Okay, API controller, routing behavior and conventions. So we'll try to understand the API controller, routing behavior and conventions in the next session. Okay, so let's catch up in the next session. Thank you. Thanks for watching.